Good morning and thank you for joining us. We will begin right at 8:30. Good morning and thank you for joining us. We will begin at 8:30. Good morning and thank you for joining us. We will begin in just a moment.
Good morning and welcome on this snowy Pittsburgh morning. I'm Bobby Wykier, President and CEO of United Way of Southwestern Pennsylvania, and welcome to the question before us. This is our fourth session of the series and the first of several we have planned for 2022. Last year, the question before us provided some meaningful and in-depth discussions with our community and top leaders on tough questions of the day, such as how has COVID escalated existing inequalities in childcare? And how can we better care for the needs of our aging population in what we soon hope to be a post-pandemic world? These sessions sparked a lot of discussion and helped inform how United Way continues to respond to these needs with compassion. This series is free and open to everyone in our community, and it would not be possible without the support of the Eden Hall Foundation. So thank you, Eden Hall. All the prior Question Before Us sessions are available on United Way's YouTube channel. A link should be appearing in the chat, and I invite you to subscribe. Magically, there it is. Today's Question Before Us is very topical. After all, it's Martin Luther King Jr. Day. But it's also a subject that has dominated and defined the American experience throughout our history. Dr. King's life and legacy shined a spotlight on the terrible injustices and inequities that exist in our society. His heroic actions and speeches forced our nation to reckon with how it has failed to live up to the ideals of equity and liberty. The fact that we're still grappling with many of these same issues more than a half a century after Dr. King's assassination is confounding. And it's a source of frustration for people who want to do the right thing, but aren't entirely sure what that looks like. One thing is certain. Before there can be meaningful action, there must be some level of shared understanding. And I can think of no better way to honor Dr. King on this day than to bring people together in pursuit of that discussion and dialogue and shared understanding. One aspect of MLK's teachings that sometimes gets lost is the effect that racism and inequity and inequality have on our society as a whole. It doesn't just harm those who are being discriminated against, it harms each and every one of us. I urge you to read more about this by picking up Heather McGee's book, The Sum of Us. This holds all of us back. Our country and our community can never realize our full potential as long as there are barriers to education, jobs, and housing based on race and ethnicity, and by extension, on the basis of gender and ability. The disparity became even more apparent during these past 2 years. I encourage you to download the latest United Way Pulse reports, which detail the disproportionate effects COVID has had on people of color in terms of hospitalization and mortality. That link should also be appearing in the chat for you. Dr. King never shied away from asking the tough questions. We are here to honor him today by continuing that dialogue in the hope of gaining some shared understanding. How can we do better, not just to promote, but embed diversity, equity, and inclusion in all aspects of our lives and communities? What are some of the specific strategies and practices we can take with us going forward in our workplaces, in our communities, and in our daily lives? We've put together a strong and diverse panel to explore this subject, along with taking your comments and questions in the chat thread. So we encourage that. So to get us started this morning, I'm really pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. James Huguley. Dr. Huguley is the Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of Pittsburgh, where he also serves as an associate professor. In addition to teaching, Dr. Huguley is also the principal investigator for the Just Discipline Project, a research to practice initiative centered on best practices in positive school climate and restorative school discipline. He also plays a leading role in the Pittsburgh Parenting Project, the Pitt Assisted Communities and Schools, and he's an executive board member for the Human Services Center Corporation, an agency supporting families and social service organizations in the Mon Valley, and also a great partner agency with United Way. Dr. Huguley received his bachelor's in English and secondary education from Providence College, and from Harvard University, he received both his master's in risk and prevention and doctorate in human development and psychology. Dr. Huguley, thank you so much for joining us on this very special day, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, Bobby, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. I'm honored to be a part of this event honoring the late, great Dr. King. It's tremendous that we can come together and honor his legacy and continue his legacy in this way. And I want to thank the United Way for putting this together and being continually committed to equity and justice in all forms. So for today, for my remarks, to get us started, I thought about Dr. King's work. And one thing that struck me in this day and time of the political challenges, the justice challenges, and they've always been there, but things are coming to light in a way that is daunting, but potentially productive, is this notion of infinite hope that he discusses. So when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion work, putting that in a framework of hope is, I think, critically important. We'll say more about that. I like to remind our audience that, and if you're a hip hop fan, you'll recognize this, It Was All Good a few years ago, quote, adaptation from Jay-Z. But just a few years ago, for some of us a few years ago, people thought we were past race. When Obama got elected, there was a lot of commentary to the effect that we are now post-racial in the United States. And here's a quote from the Wall Street Journal: "The current squabbles over race are stupid, but that is their virtue. They illustrate the pointlessness of dwelling on race." We are now in the 21st century post-partisan. How about that? Post-partisan, post-racial society from Mr. Lou Dobbs. And of course, we for a long time have had scholars talking about the declining significance of race, and William Julius Wilson's a tremendous scholar. And even going back to the 70s, he was talking about that. So there was tremendous hope at one time, but these last 2 years have suggested many different things to us. We had the police killings that are very visible. Again, things that have happened for a long time, but that have become more visible lately. With Breonna Taylor and of course, George Floyd, we had anti-Asian violence associated with COVID-19. And we know that COVID-19 has, Bobby just described, has had an enlightening effect on racial disparities in the United States when we look at who's been affected. And of course, one of the culminating events for many of us is the storming of the Capitol, which had some racial undertones. You see a man with a Confederate flag in our Capitol building just a year ago. The anniversary is just a few days ago. When we think about race, we can't lose sight of the fact that racial justice is just one form of pervasive injustice across our country and world. Another Dr. King quote is, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And that's critically important to remember. Just this weekend, we had a crisis at the congregation Beth Israel in Texas, and our thoughts and prayers go out to that congregation. Thankfully, the congregants were not hurt. But again, another terrible event on the basis of hate and discrimination. We also know that in the LGBTQ community and communities, there is tremendous oppression. 2021 was the most violent year ever recorded against trans people in the United States. And we can't be champions of justice in one area and overlook these other areas. We also have populations that we often like to push to the side and not take on in our justice movements, like formerly incarcerated peoples, which Dr. King can relate to, having served time in jail himself as part of his work. We also know that our justice system is inherently unjust. So many of people that have been formerly incarcerated, it occurred in actions that were unjust fundamentally, and now they're excluded from economic prosperity and social prosperity because of these challenges. So injustice is pervasive, and we have to be active in thinking about it in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts across the spectrum. In my own work and scholarship, I look closely at race, and I think about the fact that people very often, all of us, I'm sure, know people that think the best approach to race is to not talk about race. And with that, I will ask audiences, well, if we don't talk about race, how do we explain inequality? How do you explain what you see when you go to a community like Wexford or Fox Chapel that are predominantly white and predominantly affluent, and you go to Homewood or the Hill District and you see really the legacy of oppression and inequality? If you don't talk about race, then that can lead you to thinking about this in the sense of individual accountability. This is America. This is a meritocracy. People had their opportunities and didn't take advantage. But if you know the history, you know that that's simply not true, that structural oppressive factors have dominated the society around race for hundreds of years and didn't end with slavery by any means. And if we acknowledge those histories, which is part of our DEI call, then we can move people from thinking only about individuality to the structures that are oppressive. I like this quote from my mentor, the late great Larry Davis. He used to say, in American factories, when a car comes off the assembly line and there's a problem, we say, what's wrong with this car? In Japan, when a car comes off the assembly line and there's a problem, they say, what's wrong with the assembly line? And we really have to be critical in assessing where we've been as a society if we want to do injustices in any forms. When I talk to my students about race, we delve deep into not just theory, not just ideals, but into actual history of this country. You know, we have to start with African societies that were technologically advanced and very strong, because people just don't know that history. And they have a deficit perspective on Black people. We have to undo that first. And then we talk about this legacy of historical atrocities. We're all familiar with slavery, but do we know about the racial terror, voter suppression that happened for 100 years thereafter? That completely suppressed the Black political power that was rising in the South in Reconstruction, and the economic power as well. That's why you even need a Voting Rights Act in 1965. It didn't give Black people the right to vote. It protected it. That right came a long time ago. But we still needed protections 100 years later. Then we had 20th century economic oppression, the GI Bill, the New Deal, the housing boom, all had exclusionary intentional practices that excluded Black people and other people of color. And that is the bedrock of the inequality we see in our society. In Pittsburgh is an exemplar city, unfortunately, as much local work has shown. Once we talk about that, we can talk about the mechanisms that supported race beliefs, the media, which perpetuates stereotypes that justify the system, and the biases we all hold, as well as the current systems of wealth and education and health that perpetuate inequality through the generations. I teach my students, and I take this great quote from the Wire television show, Follow the Money. One of the things that can instill hope when we think about racism and perhaps other forms of oppression is that it's really based in self-interest. There was a need to justify the exploitation of African labor. There was a need to justify the confiscation of Native American lands. And there was a need, and this is critical, to perpetuate division among working class so that they're not in a position to fight against the system. And there's an evolution of these ideas, spiritual to biological to cultural, and now to this notion of race blindness where we're not supposed to talk about it. Well, we need to talk about it. And when we think about it, we have to understand that it's not just enough to talk about freedom. This is a quote from Lyndon B. Johnson. You don't take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him up to the starting line of a race and then say, you are free to compete with all the others and still justly believe that you have been completely fair. And there's a popular graphic on equality, which I think we tend to believe in. Everyone should be treated equally. And equity, which means we need to do something different to give people the same opportunities who have been oppressed. Sorry. Equality says this, like this picture here, that we both want apples from this tree. We have equal ladders, but the tree is not equally distributed and the tree's bent. Equity would give one a taller ladder, but what, you're still dealing with the bent tree and you're still dealing with the unequal distribution of apples. They take it a step further and say justice fixes the tree. Now what's missing from this graphic is the fact that in real life, somebody purposefully bent that tree over and they may not want you to fix it. So our battles are a little tougher. When we think about the importance of this work in diversity and equity, bell hooks recently passed, says true resistance begins with people confronting pain, whether it's their own or somebody else's, and wanting to do something about it. Learning the history of oppressed peoples generates the empathy that we need to move forward. And DEI work does this fundamentally by teaching these critical histories and current happenings, advancing the inner change work of the individual that we all need to do. You might be a champion in one area, you might be oppressive in another. We can't do it alone. Building relationships in community, working towards justice, and then getting strategic for strategies and strength to do the systemic work and taking action. And so in closing, this notion of infinite hope, what then is the answer? We must accept our unwanted and unfortunate circumstance and yet cling to our radiant hope. The answer lies in developing the capacity to accept the finite disappointment and yet cling to the infinite hope. These political times, these public health times can be very daunting for us. People are dealing with grief, people are dealing with conflict, but we have to band together like we're doing this morning, inspire us, strategize, and instill hope in one another. And I look forward to continuing that discussion. So thank you for this time. And I'm very excited to set the stage and introduce the moderator for our panel. It's Kristy Trautmann. Kristy is the executive director of the FISA Foundation, a charitable grant-making foundation that champions equity, justice, safety, and inclusion for women, girls, and people with disabilities. And so with no further ado, I would like to welcome Kristy to join us this morning. Kristy, how are you?
Thank you so much for that introduction, Dr. Huguley, and for your really powerful and pointed keynote this morning. I know so many of the things that you said resonated deeply for me on this snowy, cold Martin Luther King Jr. morning. I know we have a great group assembled with us today, well over 100 people listening and engaging today. And so I wanted to start by just inviting members of our broader community who've been listening to put into the chat their takeaway from your message this morning. I'll say, if I had to name one takeaway, it would be your reminder that when we take a race-blind approach, that really distorts the way that we look at problems and encourages us to look at the factors that individuals play as opposed to our broader systemic issues. So invite others to share their takeaway in the chat this morning. I am so honored to be part of this program and on this panel of really esteemed local experts this morning. Many thanks to the United Way, to you, Dr. Huguley, to our other panelists, and to everybody joining. I know that, and thank you to those of you who are adding in the chat. So important that we be having this conversation today. I think Dr. King is often widely quoted, but often misread, and his teachings are sometimes watered down and prettied up. And so one of the individual observances we can do today is to read some of his other teachings. So I would encourage you all, if you haven't read Letter from a Birmingham Jail, for instance, to pick that up, Google it, and spend a few minutes today. The message there has been on my heart and continues, I think, a lot of the themes and threads that Dr. Huguley brought up this morning. For me in particular, it's an exhortation that this work about undoing racism is going to be uncomfortable, and that we have a responsibility, particularly when we have privilege, particularly for white people, to lean forward into the discomfort in service of real and meaningful change. So with that, I'd like to introduce the rest of our panel. Joining me today are two additional distinguished guests. First, please welcome Elizabeth Short. Elizabeth serves as Executive Director of YWCA Butler and is committed to empowering women, eliminating racism, standing up for social justice, and strengthening communities. Elizabeth joined YWCA Butler in 2018, bringing 20 years of experience in strategy, business development, communications, and market research. She earned a bachelor's degree in political science and urban studies from the University of Pittsburgh. Currently, she serves as chair of the advisory board of Butler Catholic School and was the first non-faculty member to chair the school's prestigious Middle States accreditation process. you want to say hi, Elizabeth?
Hello, everyone from snowy Butler County. Hope you're all
Excellent.
doing well this morning.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And rounding out the panel this morning is Marsha Jones, soon to be former Executive Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer for the PNC Financial Services Group. Marsha has announced her retirement in the next few months. She is one of Pittsburgh's most esteemed and accomplished leaders in DEI. Marsha leads the development and implementation of strategies and programs that build and sustain a talented, diverse workforce and a culture of inclusion. She is a frequent national guest speaker, panelist, and lecturer on the business case for diversity and the impact that inclusive cultures have on corporate innovation. Her accomplishments in the field of diversity were a feature story in Diversity Executive magazine. Marsha Jones joined PNC after a distinguished career of more than 25 years at Merrill Lynch. Over the course of her tenure, each of the sales management executive positions she held marked a milestone for African-American women in the financial services industry. Marsha holds a bachelor's degree from Lehman College, a master's degree from Columbia University, and is a graduate of the Executive Leadership Development Program at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Would you like to say hi, Marsha?
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you and looking forward to our dialogue.
Thank you. So let's dive in. I guess where I'll start is that we, in the last couple of years in particular, are having really important, very overdue conversations about race and structural racism, which is incredibly important to us in Southwestern Pennsylvania, where Black citizens experience extreme disparities and inequities due to racism, worse than in many other cities. You can learn more about this in the Pulse report and in numerous other local publications. In conversations about equity, though, it's important that we hold for some nuance. Racism isn't experienced the same by all people of color. And so, are there other factors we need to be considering at the same time as race in our DEI focus? What might we be leaving out? Marsha, would you start us off here?
Thank you, Kristy, for and I would say part of what is important for us to recognize is that when we talk about discussions, very often we are not really having open discussions. We, in many cases, are having monologues and at best, perhaps conversations with individuals that have the same perspective or the same experiences that we do. And so one of the major things that I think is really very important for us to do is to be able to begin to further expand the networks that we have so that, and have the ability to be able to have those kinds of discussions with individuals that are in fact different than ourselves, so that we begin to really understand, develop trust, okay, over time, and to begin to really understand the conditions and the experiences that they have, so that we can then be that much more impactful in terms of how we might be able to assist and further fill the gap, if you would, to be able to create what Dr. Huguley has indicated is an infinite hope that we might have for them and for our various organizations within the region.
Thank you very much. And it is so true that most of us live in echo chambers of people who think like us and have experiences like us, and that true change requires us reaching beyond that, which can be uncomfortable, but is really important for actual dialogue and change. Elizabeth, how about you? What would you say in terms of our what we should be thinking about in our DEI conversations?
Well, I think one of the very important things to focus on, as Marsha mentioned, is expanding the network. And I think the past few years, particularly with COVID, gives us an opportunity to do that if you're there and you're looking for it. So I think about the individuals who may not have been able to participate in our workforce. Maybe they were a caregiver that needed flexibility. Maybe they were someone who was experiencing a disability that made coming into an office impossible. And, for many, many years, remote work wasn't a possibility. And until COVID made it mandatory for all of us. So now I think there is an opportunity to be gained in that difficulty that we've all been through as a way to access a wider talent pool, to open ourselves to new experiences and communities, and take that opportunity and grow.
Thank you very much for that, Elizabeth. And if I might take the moderator's privilege to jump in here, I think you're right that some of the changes that were made in the last few years, remote work being one of them, have broadened possibilities for engagement with people who were shut out before. As Dr. Huguley indicated when he introduced me, that part of FISA Foundation's work has to do with empowering and addressing disparities affecting people with disabilities. We tend to think of people with disabilities as a person using a wheelchair, maybe a person who's blind, but disability actually encompasses a broad range of things, everything from those kinds of disabilities to mental health conditions, other invisible learning disabilities, chronic health conditions. And we've seen that the intersection of racial justice and disability is a place where some of the most severe disparities live. For instance, when we talk about essential workers who've been really remarkable heroes in allowing our community to really continue operating through the pandemic, many of those were people of color who had underlying medical conditions. And so the challenges that they faced as a person of color, as a person with disabilities, operating without PPE and in service of our broader community, I think asking some of these intersectional questions leads us there. Dr. Huguley, though, I wanted to give you the opportunity to also answer this question.
Kristy, thanks. And I echo what my fellow panelists have already said, and what you just said was something I was going to touch on as well on the intersectionality front end. When we're thinking strategically, the intersectionality is really important, because how you respond to racial inequality and say policing really needs to take into account that Black folks with mental health challenges are especially victimized in those scenarios. So we have to understand race, we have to understand mental health to really address that. When we think about school discipline, Black students are subject to more exclusionary discipline than other groups, but the way it affects boys and girls is different. Black boys have the absolute highest number of disciplinary infractions, regardless of what was committed, or even in equal situations with their peers. But the disparities are larger between Black girls and white girls. And so our points of intervention and how we might respond are different, because our ideas of femininity affect that disparity, and masculinity and those notions. And so we have to be responsive in ways that are intersectional. And I also think that this historical piece is so important. Many of us are very, very good-willed and want to do the right thing, but have only a vague sense of their histories and even contemporary issues as they relate to inequity and injustice and violence. And we need to really understand the depth of these issues. When you look at 20th century economic oppression and how it was not an accident, even conservative folks that I've had a chance to speak to on these issues, including a very interesting conversation with an Uber driver not too long ago, find that very compelling. And so we have to be ready to use and speak these truths, and to do that, we have to know them.
Kristy, if I could just add to Dr. Huguley's point, and that is the conditions, many of the conditions that he described relative to youngsters in school were even pre-pandemic, right? And now after we get into the pandemic and we have experienced the impact that COVID has had, the impact that their virtual learning or lack thereof has actually taken place. It has really exacerbated, if you would, those conditions. And as a result of that, we, number one, need to be mindful of that and also take that into account as we're talking about, the conversations that need to take place. Other than just race, it's the impact that this has actually had in terms of all aspects of our society.
Very well said. Thank you for adding that, Marsha. I just want to appreciate in addition to our wonderful panelists, what great engagement we're having with all of you, our audience of participants today. And so would like to encourage you to post your questions in the chat throughout the next moderated part of the panel, and then we'll get to your questions at the end. Really appreciate that. We'll do our best to get to everything. For our next question, I want to really direct this to Elizabeth and Marsha. Thinking of your roles, Elizabeth, Executive Director of YWCA of Butler, a small organization in a collar county, very different demographics from Allegheny County. And Marsha, your history working with really large institutions in the financial services industry. I wondered if you might each talk a little bit about your internal diversity and equity issues. Can you share a challenge maybe that you're grappling with and talk a little bit about what your approach is? Elizabeth, would you like to go first?
Sure. So as I mentioned, and you mentioned, we're up here in Butler County, which based on the data from the most recent census is about 94% white, non-Hispanic or Latino. So our challenge is really being intentional about looking for opportunities and partnerships to increase the diversity of our organization. One of provides financial support for students who are low income, underserved, or first generation college students. And those students are assigned to YWCA Butler hosts 2 Bonner students. And our goal is to really get them invested in our community and our region. On a broader level, and I don't want to make it sound of our organization. And I believe that successful diversity and inclusion efforts really start at the top of the organization. And for us, that's our board. Every year we board members so we can see how we're faring when it comes to building a board that looks like our community and also reflects the communities that we serve. So we have members of our board different genders, backgrounds, sexuality. So I think for organizations that may be in a similar situation as YWCA Butler, being intentional about making that a
So we seem to be having some technical challenges today, Elizabeth. You went in and out a little bit with freezing, but I think we got a lot of your message. And I certainly want to underscore what you said about starting internally, looking at your board of directors, who is really at the table for making key decisions makes a huge difference in terms of how organizations and systems operate. Marsha, let's turn to you next.
I would certainly echo Elizabeth's comments relative to it starting at the top of the organization. And for us, certainly the board of directors has an impact in terms of the focus of our organization. We do in fact have an equity and inclusion subcommittee that has actually been created for the purpose of making sure that we are instilling within the culture of the organization focuses that bring out equity and inclusion, as well as focused on our ESG efforts. What I would also say, however, is that for the majority of the organization, the 62,000 or so employees, that it really starts at the top of the organization that they relate to, which is our CEO, Bill Demchak. And he has, for his entire tenure, had the focus of being intentional about creating a diverse and inclusive organization because of the fact that he's been able to bring his own personal experiences to the table. He personally had experiences as he was earlier on in his career of working on diverse teams. And so as a result of that, he brings that passion and that intentionality of being able to make sure that that is embedded within the organization. And certainly after you have that intent, you then have to be able to put together a strategy that emulates the culture and is responsive to the culture of that particular organization, because every organization's culture is going to be unique. And so as well as every organization's placement in their journey toward creating an inclusive culture is going to be different as well. And so it starts by, in a sense, holding a mirror up to the organization, recognizing where you are in a very pragmatic way about creating an inclusive environment, and then putting together a customized approach that works for that particular organization, utilizing the template of what are some key pillars in terms of the creation of an inclusive environment. One of the things that I think we all have to recognize is the fact that, and we talked a little bit about this in terms of the impact of COVID, but we also have to recognize that we now have a workforce of millennials who have very high expectations in terms of the experiences that they want to be able to have in the organizations that they are devoting their time to. They are very focused, surveys have indicated over the last couple of years, in finding a purpose that they have that models and that correlates with the purpose of the organizations that they are serving. And so it's important for us as an organization, as leaders in an organization, to be able to make sure that we are messaging and that we are in tune with those particular purposes and values, so that in fact we can help to not only recruit, retain, develop, etc., our talent, because that is really how we're going to be able to move these organizations forward in terms of creating this inclusive environment.
Thank you so much for that. Totally agree that really leadership from the top is incredibly important for the many leaders who have joined us today. I think to be clear about your commitment and to operationalize that internally and externally is incredibly important. And I also appreciate, Marsha, what you said about this is a custom approach, that every organization is seated in a different way, has a different internal and external stakeholders, is at a different point in conversation. And so there's really no one size fits all, although certainly there are tenets that we need to all observe in moving forward on DEI issues. Elizabeth, I'm glad you are back with us. We'll keep our fingers crossed that connectivity is friendly to us for the rest of this panel, but really appreciate that. Thank you.
A quick point, and that is that I think it's important for our guests to recognize the fact that diversity, equity, inclusion is not a program. it isn't necessarily one thing that is done, whether it's education, whether it's a recruiting aspect, et cetera. It really is a process. And it is a very all-encompassing process with various tentacles that, that need to be taken into consideration in order for it to be successful.
A very important point to end on. Honesty, not a program. It's something we all do every day, in every moment, and that whenever we have gaps between how we've behaved or how we've been understood and what our intention was, we apologize, fix it, and move forward. So thank you for reminding us that this has to be part of what we do, all of us every day, and not a siloed special thing over there that somebody else is taking care of. So I'd love, and thank you very much to everybody who is posting great both resources and questions in the chat. Keep them coming. We'll be getting to those. So with our next question, I'd like to shift a little bit, building on some of Marsha's comments about who's in our workforce and what really are they looking for. I think many companies and organizations have been focused on recruiting candidates of color or diverse candidates in a variety of ways to join the workforce or join their boards. So beyond recruiting though, what else should employers focus on? How else do we ensure equitable practices for our current employees? Dr. Huguley, would you like to start us off with this question?
Absolutely, absolutely. With the caveat that I work in the university, which is not the same as other workspaces, but there are a lot of similarities. But I will say, I think anywhere you work, one of the things that you have to, one of the starting points in building that your equitable practices is moving from goodwill, right? Because even people that have race blindness have goodwill. When the George Floyd event occurred, I got emails from colleagues that would say, I'm very sorry this happened. I hope you're okay. All lives matter. And I got, when we started talking about race, some people said, it may be divisive to talk about race. And even though they wanted everyone treated equally, but as we discussed earlier, you have to talk about it to get through it. And you have to move from that goodwill, which is very often there, to action. And that's several steps, in our opinion, in the process and the way we're working towards it in our school and university. There's the inner work of self-change. And I think that's a starting point. And being able to, build on collective knowledge, right? And someone asked very specifically, there's been a couple of questions in the chat around where to start. In our department, we started with the How to Be Anti-Racist book by Ibram Kendi, because it's very accessible. It gives the history, it's personalized, and it moved a lot of people. Some of those same people that were sending their email at the beginning of the year around, we shouldn't talk about race, we're sending an email at the end of the year saying, let's keep these conversations going. Because, the reality is sort of undeniable once you engage. And so that was a good starting point for us. I put a link in the chat to our Center on Race's resource list that's on our website. So you can see that link for other pieces that might be very helpful, books, videos, and etc. But then there's another transition, and it's moving from that inner work where everyone's on board, we need to move in this direction, to moving into the relational work around how we actually treat each other. And that can be more difficult. And that's really being empathetic in both directions, and coming with an open mind, understanding you may have wronged someone, but listening. And, they talk about calling in versus calling out. When people make mistakes, being willing to acknowledge those mistakes in a way that you're giving them a chance to redeem themselves. And so what does that look like? What are your mechanisms for reconciliation in your organization? Do you have like an ombudsperson that people trust to go to with challenges? Do you have affinity groups where people can feel supported in their environment? For us, and these are all questions we're grappling with right now in our strategic planning process. when you bring employees in, and Pitt just brought over 20 new Black faculty in with the Black Faculty Initiative. We're building systems so that they feel supported and connected. And we need to do that in our organizations. Then you start thinking about your systems. What are your systems for bringing people in and getting the people you're looking for? And then what are your systems for supporting them as they go? And how do you know you're doing well with them? Part of that is through climate survey and thinking about what your institution looks like. We're in the process of revamping our own climate survey, bringing everyone to the table, students included, to say, what do you need to feel supported here? And how do you feel right now? Marsha mentioned some of this feedback from the millennials in her organization. We need that kind of feedback in the DEI space to know how we're doing. And we need that people to feel like they can answer that honestly. And I feel like, you start to see the fruits of this labor when you see everyone taking ownership. So for example, I'm Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I've only been in this role since August. In the beginning, I would see an email that came out from one of my colleagues advertising some racial justice event somewhere, and I'd say, oh, they didn't tell me they were going to do that. And then I realized, wait a second, no, that's exactly what we want. We don't want this work to be siloed in our diversity and equity offices. We want this work to be pervasive across our organizations. So when you start to see that, then you know you're making leeway, because people are owning it and they're comfortable owning it in their various roles. And trust me, you can't do this only from a DEI office. It has to be a shared value and shared set of actions. So those are a few things that we're thinking about.
What a beautiful arc you painted, from connecting the individual work of learning and reflection with making real changes in our own behavior, with really shifting the emphasis to systems. So important, I think, for all of us, particularly for leaders, to think about that arc and connecting information together. Somebody asked, Dr. Huguley, can you repost the link in the chat? Because I know I didn't see it, and I think people are really eager to follow up with that. Elizabeth, would you like to go next on this question about creating a really equitable and inclusive workforce culture?
Sure. Well, when I think about it, I'm going to turn my camera off to see if that helps a bit. So when I really think about it, it really starts to me when people are brought on and onboarded, and there is a pretty significant effort that YWCA has undertaken with regards to pay equity. And we're a really proud partner with our sister association, YWCA Greater Pittsburgh, who, along with the Black Women's Policy Center and the Women and Girls Foundation, has created a regional partnership to advocate for change as a way of closing pay gaps. And we at YWCA Butler have put into practice some policies that help advance that. So for instance, we've never posted a job without a salary range attached to it. We don't require pay history. We don't even ask about it in our hiring process. And we make sure our employees understand that there's absolutely no retaliation if they choose to disclose their wage or salary with their coworkers. So that's what we work on as people are sort of coming in the door. But when I think about your operations, particularly from a leadership perspective, I think there's an opportunity to look at the data you may have, and if it's possible to disaggregate that by things like race, gender, ability, if you have a chance to look at employee engagement, that can give you some really important feedback. But I think you also need to look at pay increases, who's receiving those, advancement opportunities, who's receiving those, and even going a little deeper, like who is receiving professional development at your organization, who is getting those opportunities, who's getting mentorship, where's their turnover, and why? Is there something in your environment that is creating that? So I noticed in the chat that someone said, are there small or simple things that we can do to promote a better environment? Even something as simple as ensuring that you have a gender neutral bathroom in your location. Do you have non-binary gender choices on forms that you have? Can you do a blind screening of resumes that you receive in your hiring process? Can you offer a standard schedule to those who work shifts? Those are just some of the smaller things that you can do to create an environment where people feel as if they can bring their whole selves to work.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth. We were able to hear you much better with your camera off. So sorry we weren't able to see you as you were presenting, but that was a really smart thing to do. Thank you for reminding us about the power of looking at our own data, that we have a lot of information internally in terms of who's getting opportunities, how are we doing what we're doing, how is our culture really working and perceived by everyone. So thank you for getting really concrete about some of those recommendations. Marsha, what would you add?
I would add, certainly there have been a lot that has actually been covered by our fellow panelists, and I would share that many of these activities, and to take off on Elizabeth's comments relative to the data, we have a saying that says what gets measured gets done. And so what you want to be able to do is to be able to create metrics, data systems that help you to be able to measure the progress that you're actually taking. So whether you're looking at your demographic data, whether you're looking at how promotions are actually taking place within the organization, your turnover, et cetera, all of that helps to be able to provide your managers of people and to the executives around how well you're actually doing in terms of creating this inclusive environment. I think your original question, Kristy, was, now that you have this diversity within the organization, what do you do? And essentially what you're looking to do is to create an inclusive environment so that these individuals are actually welcomed into, so that they feel that they have a sense of belonging. And so many of the tactics, if you would, that both Dr. Huguley as well as Elizabeth mentioned are a part and parcel, if you would, of that creation of that inclusive culture. But to take it a little step further, we might be able to think about the communication of the inclusive environment that you're making and all of the provisions that you are making for individuals so that they can in fact feel that they belong. So in addition to the job descriptions that are actually accessible, as well as the rankings in terms of wages that are fully available, so that there's transparency relative to that, that you look when you're thinking of hiring for a skills-based hiring experience, and not necessarily just to be able to have a degree. We have found in many cases that a degree is not necessarily necessary for some of the positions that we actually have. And so if you take a broader view in terms of what those skills are actually needed, that helps you to be able to focus on the broader pool of opportunities that there might be. We have for a long time been procurers of the Rooney Rule. And so we require that there be diverse slates. And that is a broad view of diversity, not necessarily just gender and race, but a broad view of diversity for the slates that we have, because of the fact that we recognize that that diversity of thought and experiences that each of these individuals bring to a team make us as an organization that much more productive and that much more innovative. We also think about providing inclusive incentives so that, very often there used to be black tie events that were taking place that, folks really enjoyed at one point, but perhaps for our current workforce, that might not necessarily be something that is focused on. So you want to be able to find out from your employees, how do they want to be recognized? Because it's that recognition that helps them to be able to recognize that they are valued, that their opinions count, and that the work that they're actually doing is really very meaningful, as well as being very well received. We want to be able to make sure that folks have equitable access to resources. So not only do you have opportunities for them to be able to grow while they are within the organization, but that they understand what those resources are and how they might be able to get access to them. And that this is communicated on an ongoing basis. And as we've talked about many times before, I can't emphasize enough the importance of finding ways to be able to listen to your employees and to be able to then but in listening, recognize that there is a responsibility to be able to take action on what it is that you are learning from them, because that will then indicate to them, it will send a message to your employees that they have, number one, been heard, but that you are actually you are intentional about following through on the recommendations that they're making. And you're not necessarily just doing it precursory to be able to say that you have actually, taken some action, but that you really are very authentic in your intent of creating this inclusive environment. And what we have worked on for any number of years is the fact that diversity, particularly in those areas, if you happen to be in a geographic area where you may not necessarily have racial diversity, there is diversity in terms of military service. There is diversity relative to sexual orientation. There's diversity relative to ability that enable you to be able to create that kind of inclusive environment and demonstrate that you are in fact intentional about creating this diverse and equitable workplace.
Terrific. Thank you very much for the many very clear recommendations of things that we can do within the workplace, within the workforce, and underscoring where you started, which is if we're not measuring what we're doing and the difference that it makes, then likely we're not doing all that we can be doing. So thank you for that. Dr. Huguley, I think that there was something that you wanted to add before we move into participant questions.
Yeah, I wanted to add on to what my colleagues were saying and think about, our review processes for employees in a couple of different ways. One, in one sense, first of all, employees of color can get called on to do work in the local community or in the organization that they don't get a credit for. In the university system, this is rampant. And it's this notion of cultural taxation, where you hire faculty of color, your tenure review process basically looks at research productivity. And then, this is me speaking, not the provost, but in my opinion, it's your research productivity, it's the money you brought in, and then there's a teaching hurdle that you have to clear and a service hurdle that you have to clear. They're typically not make or break. Where your faculty of color and your Black faculty in particular are, once they get on campus, are being asked and pulled into all these different directions to do all of this other work because people want representation. And that happens both in the university and in the community. And this can happen in the private sector as well. And so we need to be sensible of that in our universities, looking at that in our tenure review process to try to do more to make that more equitable. And then I think on the flip side, what does your employee review process include in terms of them promoting and engaging in equity initiatives? And there are ways to incentivize that. There are ways to have accountability around that, accountability with support, but this is another strategy of not only signaling that this is important to your organization, but also to build in accountability and pathways towards recognition around the fight for racial and social justice.
Thank you so much. That was a really important ad, taking us to the next level from first steps to next steps, which we need to continually do. I have lots more questions for our panel, but I wanted to turn next to some of the great questions that have come up in the chat. So somebody asked about readings and ways to learn, which I know we could all have our favorite reading lists. The United Way generously posted a link to resources, but I'm wondering for each of our panelists, is there one favorite thing that you have that you would put at the top of your reading list in terms of a recommendation for people who really want to know and better understand in this space? Elizabeth, do you have one? You're muted, Elizabeth.
I was
Oh, there you go.
muted. I know. We said it was going to happen, and I thought it might be me that it would happen to. One of the books that has really made an impact on me is the book Waking Up White. It is the author's journey towards greater understanding in this space, and reading about her journey and her thoughts opened my eyes to where I was on my journey. You know, paraphrasing Dr. King, are you more interested in order? Or are you more interested in justice? So that's what I try to orient myself towards justice every day.
Thank you for that, Elizabeth. Waking Up White. I wrote that down, added that to my reading list. That's one I haven't seen. Marsha, how about you? I saw it looked like you were going through your own bookshelf right there for your favorites.
And I didn't get to it. But what I would say is very often folks are uncomfortable, and I think Dr. Huguley might have shared this in one of his comments, the basis of this before, in as you are opening up and you're expanding your network about saying the right thing. And so there is a book about what if I say the wrong thing, okay? And I will share with you as I find the author of the comment, I'll add that to the chat so that you have that. But what it shares essentially is the fact that it is with the positive intent that you have these conversations, and that you begin to recognize that as you share that and say, hey, look, I don't mean to offend, but please correct me, or share with me your thoughts as to how I might be able to address this in a more positive way. But I would share that for me off the top, if you're getting started and you want to be able to expand your horizons and your network, that might be a start. That might be a start. And as you indicated, there are any number of book lists that are available. And I think Dr. Huguley talked about this as the way that the university may have started having their conversations. Having and putting together quote unquote book clubs, which many of our employee business resource groups do at PNC, helps us to begin to start those kinds of dialogues and that sharing of ideas, which we've talked about in the chat. That help us to be able to learn from one another, as well as to be able to move us forward in terms of this inclusive journey.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Dr. Huguley?
Those are great resources, and thank you for everyone. There are other people putting resources in the chat as well. I'm gonna go a slightly different route because I'm gonna suggest some movies, and I mean documentary films. That still wants to be serious scholars, but anything from Henry Lewis's Gates he has multiple series on African American and actually African diasporic experiences. So I'm putting two in the chat right now. One on Africa's great civilizations, and I kind of briefly alluded to this earlier, but it's so important for us to understand historical perspectives of African civilizations, Native and indigenous civilizations in the Americas, because there is a pervasive lie that these civilizations were not sophisticated or these civilizations were primitive, and it's just not the case, you know? And if you believe that, then it's easy to believe that racial inequality is because of racial differences in the people and not because of the self-interested, exploitive systems. And so I think that series, and it's just a great series. And so that's one. And then the other link is to his series on Reconstruction, the period after the Civil War, about 10 years, where there was actually tremendous economic and political progress for the 4 million, just think about that, 4 million former slaves thrust into society with no resources, no jobs, no property. And the progress they were making before it was purposefully put down through terrorism and political manipulations. One very illustrative fact from that series, there was a higher proportion of Black politicians in the South in 1870 than there was in 1980. And that's amazing to think about. And it just goes to show that people were moving, people were empowered, people were making things happen until the powers that be worked actively to put that down. And so when you understand those histories and you understand that that's after slavery, then you understand the realities and the challenges that we're dealing with and fighting for in American society. And lastly, their videos. So if you're not a big reader, you can watch them. If you're like me and sneak these things in when you're cleaning the kitchen, then you can do that as well.
Wow, those are great recommendations. And thanks for taking us outside of the books to look at other ways of learning. And I would sort of echo the lessons of Reconstruction are really, really applicable right now for any students of history. What it was that happened is a window into what's going on now in our country. So I'm going to add my recommendations as well. One book that I found to be utterly transformative of the way that I understood the systemic nature of racism was Dr. Wilkerson's book called Caste, that really looked at the unseen structures and assumptions that keep things the way they are in terms of how racism plays out in our culture. And since Dr. Huguley got two, then I'm going to have two too. And I would say another recommendation is Me and White Supremacy, which has been around for a while, is a great book for book clubs. We'll actually be pretty soon inviting people to participate in a book club about Me and White Supremacy online as part of a workshop series FISA and others have been working on. But it takes a lot of lessons about racism and privilege, breaks them down into very short chapters with some journaling prompts and some opportunities to really discuss. So we are running super short on time. I wanted to acknowledge that we had a number of people ask questions about action steps. And I think our panelists have done a superb job of operationalizing some of these ideas and giving some really concrete recommendations. So I don't feel too bad that we didn't get to talk back about that some more. But one question that I thought was really poignant, and maybe we can end here before turning this over to Bobby, is somebody asked the question of why are conversations about race so hard? And how can we do a better job of coming from a place of open-heartedness rather than staying on the surface and talking theoretically? So last comments from our panelists about that. Who would like to go first?
I think that there is the importance that we recognize that it is an emotional topic. And that in that emotion, and to some extent, this is what early practitioners of diversity and inclusion, and I'm talking decades ago, okay, experienced when they felt that in having these conversations in various corporations that you were pointing a finger at what individuals did wrong, right? We recognize the fact that that is not the intent nor the case in this situation. What we're looking to do is to be able to share and have a better understanding of experiences, conditions that are existing in our society, of having an authentic way of being able to hold the mirror up to our society and see where we are, and to begin to peel the onion back in a pragmatic way as to where and how we got to where we currently are. And if we can remember that it only takes one, or it only takes one individual to be able to help, to be able to begin to have those kinds of conversations that ultimately have and can create concentric circles to be able to spread this, that this will help us to be able to have those kinds of authentic conversations with one another that take the emotion out of it. It's almost like, okay, here's where we are. Now, what are we going to do about creating a better environment for our children, for our grandchildren, and beyond? And I would just like to close, Kristy, in my comments in saying that we would be remiss, I believe, in recognizing on Martin Luther King Day the great commandment that we have been given, which is really to love one another and to care for one another. And all of the work that we are doing in so many of our organizations are actually filling out that mission.
That's a beautiful last comment. Thank you very much, Marsha. Elizabeth?
Yes, so from my perspective, sometimes these conversations can be difficult because, as a white woman, this wasn't a topic, race wasn't a topic that was discussed in my, during my upbringing. And I sort of swam in the sea of whiteness, of race, without even recognizing the water around me. And what I try and do now is to implement in our organization what I call the Ted Lasso rule of being curious, not judgmental. If we can come to one another with curiosity and wonder rather than judgment or assumptions, I find that we can move things along in a much more positive way.
Thank you for that, Elizabeth, the Ted Lasso rule. Dr. Huguley?
Yeah, and I want to say, to Marsha's point, I had toggled between, the theme for today, and a notion of love as part of the theme, because I think that's such a powerful motivating factor, hope and love in loving our neighbors as we do this work, and it's critically important. I think when we think about why these conversations are hard, they can be hard for different reasons. I think for white folks, there can be some avoidance of potentially uncomfortable situations and guilt, not wanting to be seen as racist. And then there are some people that just think that by having these conversations, you're giving power to these differences, which I think is that's sort of the race blind perspective. I don't want to highlight differences that should be arbitrary. I've gotten that feedback even from Black people in doing the work that we do. But again, if we don't talk about race, how do we explain inequality? And I think, the other piece of it is, and this transcends race, this goes to all manners of privilege. You just don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, if you're not in the oppressed group. And we have to, because it's not going to affect you. And in these conversations, sometimes, we end up being holders of each other's pain. And that can be very uncomfortable. And we don't necessarily have to put each other I mean, we don't have to hold other people's pain. We tend to avoid that in life many times. But to advance our society, to advance our workplaces, we have to do that. You know, oppressed people, sometimes they don't want to talk about these issues because they have fatigue from talking about these issues. Or they don't want to be re-traumatized. Oftentimes they don't need the 101 version of these conversations because they already know that content. So we have to be nuanced and supportive in how we create these conversations. Probably need multiple levels of these conversations. But at the end of the day, we have to, and this is going back to bell hooks, we all have experienced pain. So we all know what that feels like and leverage that to be able to engage in these conversations to alleviate others, the pain of others, and build hope for ourselves, for society, and for our children.
Thank you, Dr. Huguley, and thank you for naming the oceans of pain that racism has caused to so many people of color over the many generations of this country. Before I turn it over to Bobby, I guess my reflection, like Elizabeth, as a white person in this space, looking back and thinking one of the ways that I made conversations hard was I'm a perfectionist, right? I like to get an A on things. I like to do it right. I like to know what I'm supposed to know and be prepared. And for a long time, literally the worst thing I could imagine is that somebody would call out something that I had done as being racist. And I realized that by centering that fear of not getting it right, of saying or doing something that would expose the fact that I've swallowed some of this poison of racism like everybody else, that by centering my perfectionism and what's called white fragility, I was actually shutting down the opportunity to have reparative conversations about this. And so in holding for how do we navigate the pain, how do we bring repair into this space, how do we tell the truth about it, I think one of my lessons is we have to be prepared to stay in it when it's hard and when we make mistakes. To recognize that we have caused pain and that probably will cause more pain, but that the long term, if we stay in the spirit of love, of repair, of justice, that takes us forward in ways that I think we all desperately need to go. And so thank you so much to our panelists, to Dr. Huguley, Marsha Jones, Elizabeth Short, for being here today. And I'd like to turn it over to Bobby. Thank you to the United Way for opening up this conversation.
Thank you so much, Kristy and Dr. Huguley, Marsha, and Elizabeth. I honestly hated to turn my camera back on. This conversation has been so robust. And what I especially appreciated about it is that it was both practical and reflective. So I think that the participants today can take away some very real things that we can do to continue the work and continue the conversation. But it also, I think, caused us to dig a little deeper and to think about the ways that we show up or not show up in this conversation. So I really appreciate the way that you navigated that balance for us this morning and provided the space for us to be able to tackle this conversation. Earlier in the introductory remarks, I made the observation that people weren't certain what they should do in order to advance the teachings of Dr. King. Well, I think we've gotten a lot from this conversation this morning for you to take back, for me to take back to our organizations and with our circle of friends and family. Also, Martin Luther King Day is generally viewed as a day of service in our country and communities, and some of you may have signed up for some of those opportunities. I know with the Snowmageddon, it's made it a little bit more difficult to be out and about today, but if you don't have that opportunity, well, I might suggest maybe even just going and helping your neighbor shovel out his or her driveway might be a good step today for you to offer some service in honor of this day. I also am sharing with you one of my favorite Martin Luther King Jr. quotes, along with one of my favorite young people pictured in the photo here as well. And it's one of the things that I'd like to leave you with today, hopefully a little bit of inspiration of make a career of humanity, commit yourself to the noble struggle for equal rights. I would also add equity and justice. You will make a greater person of yourself, a greater nation of your country, and a finer world to live in. There's so much work that we have to do to advance equity in our nation and our community. But on behalf of United Way of Southwestern Pennsylvania, I want to thank all of you for starting your Martin Luther King Jr. Day out with us. We'll be posting this entire forum on our YouTube page. Again, encourage you to subscribe to our page. And I would ask you to share it with others in your organization so that you can continue this conversation. The question before us will return later this spring with another important topic. So we ask you to look forward to that announcement. And I would just invite you all to have a safe, wonderful Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And let's all go make this a finer world in which to live. Thank you so much.